December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It will forever be known as the tragic Sunday morning when the Imperial Japanese Navy successfully orchestrated a surprise military strike against the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, located on the south side of Oahu, just west of Honolulu. Although war had never been officially declared between the US and Japan, tensions had been on the rise for years now, and in order for the Japanese to infiltrate Southeast Asia and the East Indies without interference from the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto made a bold attempt to cripple any battleships, aircraft, and weapons that were stationed at the US Fleet's headquarters in Hawaii. The grueling 2-hour raid killed or injured over 3,000 Americans and damaged or completely destroyed hundreds of planes and 21 vessels, including 8 naval battleships. The USS Arizona battleship took the most damage by far when its ammunition magazines were hit by a Japanese bomb and thunderously exploded. The Arizona's devastation alone resulted in the deaths of 1,177 crewmen, more than half of the raid's total American casualties. When the attack was over, the United States was left frightened, angry, and ready to enter World War II. Like almost any historical American tragedy, it's pretty much a given that numerous movies have been made on the subject, many of them filmed right here at the site where the attack actually occurred. The way I see it, no visit to Oahu is complete without embarking on an excursion to Pearl Harbor for a little historical insight. So I'm off to visit not only one of the island's most popular sites for Hollywood to use in movies, but also one of the most significant landmarks in the history of the United States. These days, Pearl Harbor continues to be a working naval base, but has also since become a meditative tourist attraction for visitors to reflect on that horrific day and take a boat tour out to the preserved wreckage of the USS Arizona. In 1962, a memorial was built right on top of the sunken Arizona battleship, which was left at the bottom of Pearl Harbor to commemorate the lives lost that day. The memorial was constructed with 7 large windows on either side and on the ceiling to represent the 7th day in December, and a marble wall towards the back is inscribed with all 1,177 names of those killed on the Arizona during the strike. Looking out from one of these giant windows, you can still see the battleship's corroded, algae-covered remains just below the water, while other rusted parts barely break the surface. However, to me, the most haunting sight is the oil that has continued to leak out from the ship and float to the surface since the day it sank. There is a genuine sense of emotional gravity that comes with visiting Pearl Harbor, because no matter how many movies you watch on the subject, or even how much old black and white footage you've seen of the actual attack, being there makes it feel just a little more real. Now, I'm sure when you think of movies about Pearl Harbor, the first film that comes to mind is the 2001 summer blockbuster Pearl Harbor. But it's unfortunate that the movie titled Pearl Harbor had to be the worst of the bunch. I mean, sure, it filmed here in Hawaii, but that certainly does not make it a great movie. Hot on the heels of James Cameron's Titanic, producer Jerry Bruckheimer and director Michael Bay were clearly trying to emulate Titanic's blend of romantic drama and historical tragedy, but the results were, let's face it, pretty ridiculous. I'll say the film's cinematography is stellar. The special effects were top-notch for their time, and composer Hans Zimmer delivers one of his many fine musical scores. But the good is heavily outweighed by endless cliches, blatant historical inaccuracies, and a goofy love triangle that eats up way too much of the painfully long runtime of a movie called Pearl Harbor. And when a director like Michael Bay is in charge of heavy-handed drama set against a real-life disaster, it simply comes across as juvenile. Whether it feels like a propaganda film by treating the Japanese like one-note diabolical war machines, or it's making the attack feel as over-the-top as an action sequence in one of his Transformers movies, Michael Bay's incessant flag-waving sensationalism in Pearl Harbor can be insulting, and even borderline offensive. But thankfully, there are several other films out there about the event that are certainly more worthy of your time. It seems that every American generation experiences that one major catastrophe that reshapes the collective public mindset and restructures common social norms. As cliched as it sounds, every generation suffers its own loss of innocence. Today, we're still feeling massive ripple effects from the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. Before that, the baby boomer generation was virtually defined by the senseless Vietnam War, and prior to that, those who grew up during the Great Depression saw their lives turned completely upside down in the wake of Pearl Harbor, which is an idea that's explored in the Oscar-winning 1953 war drama From Here to Eternity, a series of intertwining storylines about various servicemen and the women they love, and how the swift Pearl Harbor attack would change their lives forever. Montgomery Clift plays troubled soldier and middleweight boxer Private Robert E. Lee Pruitt, who was transferred from Fort Shafter Army Base in Honolulu up to the Schofield Barracks Army Base in central Oahu. Pruitt's new captain, Dana Dynamite Holmes, played by Philip Ober, deliberately makes Pruitt's new life at Schofield a living hell after Pruitt refuses to join his regimental boxing team due to personal reasons. Meanwhile, Deborah Kerr, as Holmes's desperate wife Karen, begins having an illicit affair with Sergeant Milton Warden, as portrayed by Burt Lancaster, whose character could face 20 years imprisonment if the two are ever caught together. As Pruitt tries to adjust to his new life at Schofield, he and his good friend, scrappy Private Angelo Maggio, played wonderfully by Frank Sinatra, spend their free time at a nearby gentleman's club where Pruitt begins falling for a prostitute played by Donna Reed, and as the story unravels, any hardships, distress, or violence that has occurred in the lives of these individuals will all soon be dwarfed by the sudden attack on Pearl Harbor, which looms closely on the horizon.
What did the Army ever do for you besides treat you like dirt and give you one awful going over and get your friend killed? What do you want to go back to the Army for?
What do I want to go back to the Army for? I'm a soldier.
From Here to Eternity definitely seems tame by today's standards, but in the early 50s, its realistic depictions of gritty violence, obvious sexual undertones, and displays of the brutal treatment toward soldiers were all pretty cutting edge, which resulted in the film garnering high critical praise and numerous Oscar wins, including Best Picture of 1953. The time period in which this movie was made is an interesting aspect in and of itself, considering the war had been over for only 8 years. So as opposed to decades-removed patriotic fluff like Pearl Harbor, this is a much grimmer story that takes place during a pre-war peacetime, a time that was still relatively fresh in audiences' minds. Based on the highly controversial novel by author James Jones, who was stationed at Schofield Barracks in 1941, the somewhat vague title of the book was lifted from Gentleman Rankers, a famous poem written in 1892 by Jungle Book author Rudyard Kipling, which told about soldiers of the British Empire who had lost their way and were damned from here to eternity. Admittedly, some of the plot points in the film are considerably melodramatic and at times soap opera-ish, but the acting is so well done you can't help but get sucked into these characters. Sure, some of the acting is very much of its time, but I was particularly impressed with Frank Sinatra, who, believe it or not, was considered washed up at this point, so From Here to Eternity was considered to be a significant comeback during his legendary career, and I can see why, because I think his performance is truly great, even by today's standards.
Hey, what are you gonna do, marry this guy? You're grinning on him like you're his wife.
Get out of here.
Okay, I'm going. Back to old long-legged Sandra. I love him tall. Acres and acres.
The likable comic relief his plucky character brings to the film is a breath of fresh air in an otherwise serious story, and you're definitely in his corner whenever he's confronted by the bull-headed and sadistic Sergeant Fatso Judson, played by a young Ernest Borgnine. The leads are also fantastic, most notably Montgomery Clift, who plays Robert E. Lee Pruitt as an unconventionally sensitive hero worth rooting for. And I swear, in some scenes, he is a dead ringer for Tom Cruise. Also, keep an eye out for a brief cameo appearance by none other than TV's original Superman, George Reeves. About 35 miles southeast of Schofield Barracks sits Halona Cove, a small beach that served as the backdrop for one of the most famous love scenes in cinema history. The beach is located at the bottom of a large, naturally formed rock wall, which makes it a tad difficult to access, but it is open to anyone who wants to go for a swim or is interested in checking out the same beach where Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr shared an iconic kiss among the crashing waves in From Here to Eternity. Even if you've never watched the film before, you've likely seen this footage and have probably wondered what all the fuss was about. Well, keep in mind that an army sergeant and the wife of his superior officer are engaged in a torrid affair, which for the early 50s was pretty taboo subject matter, and it's all captured in a love scene that was unlike anything seen in a big mainstream movie before. It's a brief sequence, but a groundbreaking one, that was all filmed right here at Halona Cove. Despite being located roughly 30 miles away from Pearl Harbor, Schofield Barracks actually suffered its own share of damage during the 1941 attack, along with the neighboring Wheeler Army Airfield and various other military bases on Oahu, which was done in order for the Japanese to disable as many U.S. defenses as possible and clear the way for their raid on Pearl Harbor. The climax of From Here to Eternity features a thrilling and impressively realistic recreation of the Japanese planes attacking Schofield Barracks, ending the film on a somewhat dour note as the US enters the war. Interestingly, by this time in the film, you're so wrapped up in the characters you almost forget about Pearl Harbor, but when it suddenly happens, the film cleverly intercuts the action at Schofield with stock footage from the actual attack. What From Here to Eternity does well is tell a harrowing story about soldiers during peacetime, only to have everything change instantly in a couple short hours. But if you're looking for a film that gets more into the finite details behind the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, then you'll want to check out the 1970 docudrama Tora, 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 an epic account of the events and decision-making leading up to the strike as seen from both American and Japanese perspectives that culminate in a stunning recreation filmed almost entirely at the real Pearl Harbor. In 1962, legendary producer and 20th Century Fox studio executive Darryl F. Zanuck and his co-producer Elmo Williams released The Longest Day, a film project with a star-studded ensemble cast that meticulously recreated the historical Allied invasion of Normandy, France during World War II, showing the battle from the different points of view of the Allies and the Axis powers. The Longest Day became a critical and commercial hit and was praised for its fair and balanced documentary style. Several years later, Fox was in a major financial slump, so producer Elmo Williams, studio head Darryl Zanuck, and his son, production chief Richard Zanuck, began developing Tora, 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 a war docudrama about the Pearl Harbor attack that would act as a World War II bookend to The Longest Day and hopefully be another big hit for the studio. Much like The Longest Day, the producers wanted Tora, Tora, Tora to show the attack from both American and Japanese viewpoints, and to pull this off, two separate filmmakers were tapped. Handling the American side was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Fantastic Voyage director Richard Fleischer, and famed Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa was set to direct the Japanese scenes. However, several weeks after filming started, Kurosawa began acting erratically on set and was subsequently dropped from the project. It's been said that the iconic Japanese filmmaker was feeling enormous pressure from being a hired hand on an American production, and when he felt that he didn't have full creative control over his half of the film, he had a complete nervous breakdown. Replacing Kurosawa on Tora, Tora, Tora's Japanese side were two lesser-known Japanese filmmakers, Toshio Masuda, who was in charge of the dramatic scenes, and Kinji Fukasaku, who supervised the visual effects sequences.
Maybe your boys are finally getting the range.
I hope so, sir.
Certain major hurdles, such as the burdensome coordination of a joint American-Japanese endeavor, the painstaking historical research, the endless paring down and rewriting of a screenplay that exceeded 600 pages, the construction of full-scale miniatures, the assembling of an entire arsenal of expensive military weaponry, and a studio drowning in an ever-growing production budget were all factors that added up to the unprecedented 3 years Tora, Tora, Tora spent in pre-production alone. And by the time principal photography finally wrapped in the summer of 1969, the movie had taken 4 times longer and had cost 25 times the money it took for the Japanese to carry out the real-life attack. Did all this time, money, research, and dangerous stunt work pay off at the box office? Well, at first it didn't look likely. The film was released in the US on September 23, 1970, with lukewarm critical reviews and an underwhelming performance at the domestic box office. However, it was a big hit in Japan, and has since gone on to be considered a classic recreation of the Pearl Harbor raid. But why the initially harsh critical reception? Well, critics seem to feel that Tora, Tora, Tora sacrificed harrowing drama for cold, hard historical facts, and because it lacked any relatable main characters or true emotional backbone. But I, for one, think the film accomplished exactly what it set out to do. Tora, Tora, Tora is populated with a wonderful cast of classic character actors, including Martin Balsam, Joseph Cotten, James Whitmore, E.G. Marshall, and Jason Robards, among others, all playing actual commanding officers and politicians involved in the event. No real big names were attached to the film to give it a more realistic documentary feel, and so the filmmakers didn't have to spend their dwindling budget on huge star power. Either way, to have this film stick with lesser-known names was a great decision, because when it comes to character actors, you can pretty much always count on solid performances. Tora never bothers with giving us relatable characters. So, yes, the movie is a little emotionally detached in that sense, but it is clearly more interested in focusing on the negotiations, strategies, and even blunders that eventually led to the inevitable attack, which should be, and is, the main driving force behind the film's building of drama and tension, as opposed to the Michael Bay film that spends way too much time on shoddy character development that doesn't even really pay off anyway. Also, the filmmakers knew that to accurately show Pearl Harbor, they actually had to shoot at Pearl Harbor, and at Ford Island, a small landmass less than a mile long that sits in the middle of the harbor, and housed the Naval Air Station, which was also bombed during the attack. While shooting the film's thrilling climax at Pearl Harbor and Ford Island, the film crew staged impressively realistic aerial stunts and rigged dangerous pyrotechnics that involved a complex mix of real war machinery and scale model miniatures, a remarkable achievement that would go on to receive an Oscar for Best Visual Effects. Tora, and From Here to Eternity are two great films that tell very different stories about Pearl Harbor, so please do me a favor. Forget about Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor and pick up these classics on Blu-ray instead. The Tora Digibook Blu-ray in particular received a practically flawless high-definition transfer and includes several special features, including an extended version of the film that includes a couple more Japanese scenes. I picked up my copy at the single most appropriate place in the universe to buy this film, the Pearl Harbor Historical Park gift shop. So, I hope you enjoy both of these films, while never forgetting the sacrifices made that fateful morning or the heroes that continue to keep the legacy alive.